Welcome to Moments of Grace. On this 8th episode of Moments of Grace, I am very excited and happy to see Bishop Richard Chartres on my computer. It has been some years now since I was in the London Diocese and saw Bishop Richard on a more regular basis. Bishop Richard, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, Bryce, thank you for setting this up. We miss you in London. We really do. You brought vim and imagination, and you've left behind a very sweet savor, a good memory.
I appreciate you very much in saying so. For those of you who don't know at home, Richard was Bishop of Stepney and also Bishop of London. And amongst many other things, he's also a member of the Privy Council and a life peer of the House of Lords as well. And also, as Bishop Richard has just mentioned, something I'm sure he does not want to put on his CV, but he was kind enough to welcome me in to the Church of England in the year 2007, and then deaconed me in the year of 2008. So I can't thank you enough for that.
One of the best things I did.
Excellent. Bishop Richard, any opening words for us before we get into our discussion topics?
Well, I'm really glad to be in touch, not only with you personally, but also with Charleston, of which I have the happiest possible memories from various visits. I came, I think, when I was celebrating 300 years of the parish of Beaufort. And of course, that reminds us that Charleston, the whole of South Carolina, was actually a part of the Diocese of London in the early 18th century. And I enjoyed receiving an invitation to come back because all was forgiven. But as a matter of fact, the story, which is often told, of the Bishop of London being sacked during the Revolutionary War, covers up something quite interesting. And it is the immense reluctance of those who settled in the state to have any resident bishop at all. Because, of course, there were several plans in the 18th century. The Bishop of London realized that his position was too remote, was untenable. And so there were attempts to plant a native episcopacy in the United States of America. And indeed, they got as far in Virginia as buying a house for a new bishop who was nominated, and he was a very surprising person. The person nominated to be bishop in Virginia was no less than Jonathan Swift. And history might have been very different if that had happened. So again and again, there were plans in the 18th century to plant a bishop in the Americas. But the message always came back, no, we're quite happy to stay with the Bishop of London because he's cheap, he's a long way away, he's not likely to visit, and if we have bishops actually resident here, they'll cause trouble. And so that was the actual story, which led up to the unhappy breach in relations between our two parts of the church and the appointment of Samuel Seabury, who had to be consecrated in Scotland, although he was ordained by the Bishop of London. He was ordained a priest like you by the Bishop of London, but he had to be consecrated in Scotland because the state made legal difficulties.
Thank you so much for recounting that. I think I can say without reservation, and hopefully the people of Grace can as well, that we are very happy to have your visitation with us on this podcast and videocast today.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to relate two of my experiences in the Diocese of London, in the Church of England, with the hopes of giving you a chance to speak to some of the more kind of underlying profound things that hopefully I'm able to raise in these two experiences. The first one that I found welcome but astonishing as well, given my background of leaving the Lutheran Church here in America and coming over first to Oxford, St. Stephen's House, and then into the London Diocese. Just the number of colleagues who were former Reformed ministers or Roman Catholic priests or Methodist ministers, or former Lutheran pastors like me. And just the sheer number of men and women in the Church of England, and indeed in the Diocese of London, who had that background. And it made me think, and I still wonder at times, what it is about either the Church of England, the Diocese of London, or the Anglican Communion on a whole, which is able to make us all feel comfortable and to embrace that. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think, as I think I remember saying to you when I had the privilege of ordaining you to the diaconate, we were not asking you to deny anything by becoming a priest in the Church of England, because one of the things about the tradition of the Church is that we are not named after some great theologian. We are not called Cranmerians. We really put the accent on the inheritance of the whole Church, and obviously Lutheran witness is very important in our own early history, particularly in the first part of the 16th century. But we are not captivated by any particular theological system. The first thing that we say about ourselves officially is the Church of England is part of the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. It seems to me perfectly obvious that there is only one church. There can only be one church. It was the church that Jesus Christ made out of his own body, but a church which has unhappily been fragmented ever since the Last Supper ended. So there is only one church, and we are consciously part of it in a sense that we don't want to excommunicate people who happen to be in the tradition of Martin Luther or have been Roman Catholics. We don't want to excommunicate any of those. We have never said that people from those traditions are not Christians. And so there is not so much of a high threshold to get over in that sense. And then what we say next is the Church of England is part of the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, worshipping. Now that is absolutely crucial. We are not asking people to sign up to some definite theological scheme, not to follow in a way that you might find natural if you were part of the Reformed tradition in Switzerland, the teaching of John Calvin. The first thing is worshipping. And can you worship with us in this way? We have a book of worship, which is really a tessellated pavement derived from Scripture. Almost every phrase in certainly Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer and subsequent recensions of the prayer book is derived from Scripture. So can you worship with us in this way? Because we don't see Christianity as an ideological package. And this, I think, is crucial, because so much of the division and the conflict in the church comes from reducing Jesus Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life, to some kind of ideological package which people are invited to assent to or decline from. So it is extremely important that we begin with humility, which is part, and a fairly extraordinary part. In the 16th century, very few people spoke English. In fact, if you wanted to get in touch with high culture in the 16th century, you had to learn Latin, and then you learnt the really good languages like Spanish, Italian, and French. Very few people in Europe spoke English, and it was only the very happy expansion into the New World, into the Americas, which meant that English was promoted from being, rather like a dialect of Frisian into a universal language. And that, of course, has been of enormous significance in the history of the Anglican tradition ever since. So I think I don't want to rabbit on, but I think where we start from is so important. We're just part of the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. We begin with a sense of humility at its fragmentation, which we have played a part in. You mentioned Methodism. The schism started in London, and I so regret it. And in fact, when I was going out to meet some of the charismatics in our diocese, who had got very restive because they thought there was too much law in the Church of England, I looked at the portrait of Bishop Louth. Bishop Louth was a great Hebrew scholar. He was the last bishop to have responsibility for the Americas. And he also had a very rebarbative correspondence with John Wesley, in which he forbade Wesley to ordain people for the mission in America. Absolutely not. Well, I looked at Bishop Louth and I said to myself, that is not a mistake I want to repeat, because the charismatics were saying, frankly, we could flourish outside this over-regulated church. Let's go away, let's build our own centers, let's do our own thing. And I went to visit their leadership, and I said to them, well, that would greatly impoverish the Church of England, but it would also impoverish you, because if you actually secede from a generous Catholic traditional understanding of the Christian community, you will have excitement, bounce, energy for one generation. It will ebb in generation 2, and by generation 3, it'll be stifling, conventional, and flat. And that conversation led to one of the greatest explosions of energy in the Diocese of London, as they fully committed themselves, not to their own agenda, but to our common agenda.
Thank you so much for that. And what you've done there in the end, in speaking about that experience, flows very nicely into my second experience, which I would love to hear more of your thoughts on. And that was in the deanery that I was a member of. I'm not sure I fully appreciated it at the time, but I have reflected upon it many times after. And that is, we would get together as priests in that deanery on a monthly basis. And within that room of probably 12 to 15 priests, we had everything from Anglo-Catholics to evangelicals to maybe even some charismatics and a whole bunch down the middle. And somehow, for the first time in my life in the church, I was able to experience people with those different understandings and different expressions of the Christian faith coming together, and as I like to say, eating a biscuit, drinking a cup of coffee or tea, and speaking very civilly to each other. And I wonder if you could speak to that experience that I had. Was it an anomaly, or was it something that is more inherent and deeper to what is going on in the Church of England, the Diocese of London, or indeed was it something that there was a concerted effort over many years to foster that?
We came from a very bad place, and I think that that had an impact on your experience. We have had our own schisms and broils. In fact, the shape of the Church of England as a whole was very much influenced by the ruinous civil wars of the 17th century, when a larger proportion of the English male population perished than died in the First World War. So that was an early experience, but it's an experience that we've had in the recent past with a number of schisms and departures. I mentioned a very significant one, the departure of the Methodists. John and Charles Wesley, to their dying day, asserted that they lived and died clergymen of the Church of England, but very soon, largely, I think, because of the short-sightedness and the lack of faith of the leadership of the Church of England, they became a separate denomination. So we've had a lot of experience of what happens when you can't tolerate diverse temperaments, you can't tolerate diverse cultural expressions, because of course one of the things that the Methodists did was bring in a whole new charismatic stream of hymn singing and informal gatherings. It was regarded as a horror until late in the 19th century for any Anglican clergyman to speak in the open air. This was considered to be a terrible sign of the enthusiasm, a word which now I think probably has a rather positive connotation, but then summoned up memories of what happens when religious enthusiasm gets out of control. So we had a lot of experience of what happens with schisms. And I think we're also very clear that many of them occur when the faith becomes an ideology, when it becomes my vision of God. God is infinitely beyond the capacity of our minds and our arms to embrace. When the Word was made flesh, the darkness could not comprehend, could not overcome it. So I think that there is a healthy dose of a sense of mystery. God is always a mystery. No one has seen God at any time. There is an enormous significance in the fact that alone of all the great temples in the ancient world, the heart of the Temple of Jerusalem was aniconic. God was not possessed in a definition or a cult image. So I think that there's a bundle of experiences there. And of course, in the recent past, before you were ordained, the Diocese of London was actually very faction-ridden indeed. I remember one of the things that I had to cope with when I became Bishop of Stepney in 1992 was that it had become almost impossible for people from the Edmonton area, where you were ordained and served, to be appointed in Stepney and vice versa, because the cultures were so different. And so 1992, we had a situation where, in any case, support for the church was dwindling. There were financial difficulties. There was considerable faction. And I think that year after year after year, by patience and frankly by loving people and appreciating people and not being possessed by faction. One of the great phrases I always thought was sound was, got to have a spoon in the soup. So if there are numbers of traditions living in the church, you must make sure that you don't become partisan and favor one rather than another. Many spoons in the soup, and also we can learn from one another. All of us have got certain temperaments, certain ways of viewing the world, and we ought to be open for correction from others. We need one another in the church to realize and to enter into the profundity and the amplitude and the wideness of God's love. So I think it's a combination. We've had dreadful experiences and examples of what happens when faction takes hold. We realize how deadening, reducing the faith of Jesus Christ to an ideology can be when you try to possess your own picture of God. Now that sounds all very lovely, but on the other side, there is total chaos and disintegration unless you insist on some structure and some boundaries. Because your experience of the deanery was experience of a church where diversity was encouraged, not of an utter chaos as of a group of argumentative discussion groups. And so we were utterly serious about that definition of our identity with which I began. The Church of England is part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, worshipping a faith, proclaiming the faith uniquely revealed in the Holy Scriptures and set forth in the Catholic creeds. We read the Scriptures, therefore, in company with all those other people from other cultures, other centuries, other systems of philosophy. We read the Scriptures in company with them. That's an absolutely crucial point. We are at all hand, at every point, conjured against private interpretations which are not shared in the community. And then, led by the Holy Spirit, we believe the Church has borne witness to historic truth and its various historic formularies. So here is a church not afraid to reason on the basis that the ultimate mystery is beyond us all, but not ashamed to adore. So we have a very, very strong sense that the fundamental is worship, is giving worship to God and living in the truth of Jesus Christ rather than possessing some ideological posture. Is that the beginnings of a comment on your experience? And I'm glad to hear it, but of course it wasn't the case 20 years before you arrived. And actually, I think people like yourself, with your particular gifts and your particular background, made a very considerable contribution to making it into a reality.
Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you for those refreshing and yet deeply honest comments that you've provided us today. In closing, you reminded me very much of the reality of living in that difficult tension of being in that room together. And that was how often somebody from a tradition, for lack of a better word, different than mine, either said something or quoted somebody that I would have never read because they're just outside of my reading zone, my comfort zone, but they said something in a certain way or related something that they had read that I never would have gone anywhere near on my own, but I needed to hear it that day. And just the refreshing, even though it is aggravating at times, how refreshing it is to keep those voices all together in that room, because every so often you're going to hear something that you would have never heard otherwise, and it's going to make you a bigger and better Christian as a result.
Well, I think that's right. And it's very much what I said to the charismatics. We need you. We are thirsty for your contribution. But if you hive off into your own ghetto, then you will shrink inevitably. I'm thinking long term, of course. We've had centuries to think about these things. But I think that the history of schismatic movements reflects a similar pattern. Excitement in the first couple of generations, and then increasing convention and staleness thereafter.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As we close, thank you so much again for being with us. I want to give you a chance to have the closing word.
God bless you. And God bless all the Christians of South Carolina and Charleston. I realize that there is a heavy responsibility on all Christians in the United States at the moment to navigate into a way in which you can discharge your enormous responsibilities nationally and internationally in a really godly and Christian way.
Well, we appreciate that from you, and we are, of course, also praying for all of you over in England and the difficult times that we are all going through and sharing at this time. Thank you very much.